Grüß, willkommen in einem neuen video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 77 of my game system design series of videos. In this video I'll discuss refreshing an old board game in order to give it a new lease of life. My primary gaming background is board gaming, and while I did dabble in 1/72 scale figure gaming when I was younger, I gravitated to board gaming in the 1970s to 1980s before finally moving full-time pretty much over to figure gaming with only the occasional board game. Note, I actually have a copy of this specific ancient specimen of a game here. In fact, I remember I bought it from someone in a club somewhere. I do remember a lot of good games from the past, mainly in my case from the SPI company. While many of these games were good, their graphics and finish leaves a lot to be desired compared with the more recent, flashier, blingier board games you can purchase today. Also note, I purchased these games when they first came out. War in the East came in a brown paper envelope, which looked incredibly sus. But back to the video. One of my gaming kameraden wanted to have a multiplayer World War II game and initially suggested Axis and Allies. While I have nothing against that specific game, it was something that did not really excite me a lot. We then listed all the games which we could complete in a 6 to 8 hour period, which were well balanced and fun, and I have to admit the list was very short. Actually, initially so short it was 0. After thinking about this issue for quite a while, I did remember an old board game which I enjoyed a great deal back in the old day. The old SPI World War II European Theatre of Operations, 1939-45, which came out in 1973. While I have to admit I'm not that old, so did not buy it when it first came out, I did buy a brand new copy by about 1976, and I have to admit I enjoyed playing it quite a bit. So I went back to all my old storage boxes and luckily, after finding the game, brought it out, only to be disappointed with its appearance. My specific copy had seen a lot of gameplay and was certainly worse for wear, but I remember how old board games lacked a lot of the bling due to the lack of colours which could be used when it was printed. I'm guessing SPI only had 3 colours to play with here, and 2 of these colours were the same, blue, differing only in darkness. In many ways, the counters were even more boring, some with Russian and French counters only differing in the colour of the print. The same applied to Great Britain and the US, although at least the Germans here were a little bit better. When I went to the rules, they were reasonable, which is a SPI strong point. Although, due to the long development and playtesting of the game, several critical rules are scattered around the rule books, making them difficult to find when you need to find them. It could do with some reorganising, but it's not really a major issue. The rules are quite good. After looking at the board game, particularly once I placed out all the counters, I felt it could not compete with the bling of many more recent board games, and this lack of bling would doom our multiplayer day. It was then I thought about refreshing the game, basically doing a bit of plastic surgery on it. I do not mean changing the rules. I did that actually many years in the past, in the late 1980s, and while my updated game was okay, it really did not add much to the original board game, so it never went anywhere. Instead, I just want to refresh the appearance of the board game today, to bring it into the 2020s in terms of look and feel. I also thought this may be a good opportunity to try larger hexes. Old-style board games and the more recent games use a reasonably standard hex size which can accommodate a half-inch counter. While this works well when you're young, or when I was young, with good eyesight and nimble fingers, it doesn't work so well these days. I wanted to try larger hexes and counters. I did consider a number of different sizes, but finally settled on 28mm hexes, which could easily accommodate 2cm square counters. I commonly use 2cm square counters for my figure gaming, and I know that size works very well indeed. Back in the day when I used to create my own board games, the maps I used to create typically were in A3 segments, which I would then join together. Unfortunately, my A3 printer died a while ago, so I'm going with A4 today. And there are some other benefits, specifically around storage. When my game needed to be put away, I could now break up the map into A4 sheets, and then I could easily store that into an A4 document storage box along with my counters and rules. I made the mistakes many years ago of covering all my board games with clear plastic contact, which works well for a game, that is when you have the game, but made the maps very difficult to store. I have several hundred board gaming maps, all of which are rather large, and I have to store them in an art bag, which in turn is rather difficult to store. Old age made me realise, whatever you do, make sure you've considered the storage of your games, as eventually you'll need to store them. And unless you live in a huge house with a huge library, you'll need to ensure you can store all your games in a small or as small a form factor as possible. For those interested in the technical aspect of my project, in the past I created all my maps, rules and counters using a package called StarOffice, which these days is called LibreOffice. These days I use Office 2010, which has some advantages and some disadvantages, but I must admit I may well move back to LibreOffice on Zorin for a number of reasons. After playing around with my Office 2010 and creating the map, that is duplicating it as faithfully as I could compared to the old one, this shows part of the map I created. In order to keep ink usage low, I went with light colours, in some cases perhaps too light, but otherwise the results have been quite good. The resulting map is 85 by 80 centimetres in size, which fits nicely on an average dining room table, which tends to be 90 centimetres wide at the minimum, and some of them go to 1 metre. But 90 centimetres is what you should really target as the maximum smallest dimension of any kind of map you decide to create. Of course, to make the game playable, I need to add all the charts and tables and turn records charts, and these are all on separate sheets of A4 paper, unlike the original map. Once I place two over this whole arrangement that you can see here, I place two 60 by 90 centimetre clear plastic etching sheets, which keeps everything flat on the table and allows players to clearly see what is on the table. I could have covered the whole thing in a sheet of clear plastic stick-on contact, but then I would need to deal with storage, and we've already discussed that. Board games tend not to have that much of a long shelf life, with most of my popular games only being used perhaps 6 to 12 times max, excluding, of course, board gaming competitions. And when I was engaged in board game competitions, I must have done about a dozen of them. I would often play a single game, maybe as much as 3 times in a weekend. So I would tend to use those games a lot more. But putting them to one side, once you've given a game 6 tries, maybe 12 maximum, typically you tend to pack it away. Moving over to the counters, one advantage of an inkjet printer is you can have any colour you wish. I use 1.8mm thick cardboard, so players have something to grip, and then place all the printing on 200 plus GSM paper to ensure the ink does not run due to any accidental over-gluing, which can occur if you use standard 80 GSM paper. Including some extra game aids and some optional counters, I use 4 sheets of 130 counters each to give me all the counters I need. If you ignore the extra game aids and optional counters, the original game used a counter sheet of 400 counters with some blanks. This shows the standard Russian defence against the Germans in 1941. After my test game and a lot more study, I remembered that the Russians have to learn this deployment by heart, as any errors will cause them to collapse against a good German player. This may be one reason why the game did not seem to have too much legs, as experienced players will always win against new players, thus it's pretty hard to get new players. However, I have to admit most board games are like this, which is why once a group of gamers become experienced in a game, they tend to move on to a new game. The exceptions are games such as Risk or Diplomacy, which are heavily luck-based. Skill isn't, or experience isn't, that important for those particular games. As for the rules, I tend to go overboard and create 3 versions of the same rules, one in 1-column format using a large font, a second in 2-column format using a smaller font, which you can see on the right, And finally, a 3-column version, similar to the original set of SPI rules. As we get older, our eyesight begins to fail, so creating large font versions can be required. Although I always use the 3-column format, as it's easier to find that all-important rule in the heat of a game. I actually use this methodology with all my figure gaming updates, conversions, whatever, because I find some players prefer 3-column and some players prefer the single column big font print based on age and preference. And if you want to get some traction, particularly if you create new rules, you better make sure you create a set of rules that people are willing to look at. For my first game, all the gamers were impressed and liked the results. One player did not even know this game came from the 1970s originally. However, as with my early experience with this game, there are a lot of special rules for this game, and unless you can remember them all, which there's no way you can, you need to be reminded somehow. I've created a cheat sheet for the Axis, Russians and Allied players to assist them, as in my first game I forgot many critical rules, including the combat effect of spring, which resulted in an overwhelming Axis victory. Good for the Axis player, but not so good for the Allied and Russian player. I'm certain once I've completed these final game aids, my second game will progress closer to what it should in an optimal game. There are a lot of old gems from the 1970s and 1980s, which only need a refresh to make them viable in today's world of bling. All you need is a copy of the old game, a computer with LibreOffice or PowerPoint, and an inkjet printer. And so this concludes episode 77 of my video on game system design. In this case, very unusually, looking at board games, that is specifically how to refresh an old board game and make it look fresh and new in today's world of hypercolours and bling. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.